educators in creating critical, humanizing, culturally sustaining literacy pedagogies that problematize and replace the bureaucratic, racist, and linguistic nature of US schooling. I'm joined this morning by my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Mariana Soto-Manning, Dr. Dinah Volk, Dr. Vivian Vasquez, and Dr. Michelle Myers. And I will introduce each of these brilliant leaders and activists in just a minute, but I first want to ask you to make this session as interactive as possible and use the chat feature of this Zoom session to introduce yourself and share, if you are willing, your position and from where you join us across and beyond the United States. We would also like to hear what you hope to learn from this session and any questions or connections that you make with the material shared, as we will build in time for Q&A at the end after we hear from our speakers. I do want to take a moment before we get started and acknowledge and thank Dr. Sandra Asario for the incredible behind the scenes work that she has done to pull off this virtual day of early childhood. And I do want to also remind you that this event is being live streamed, and the link to that live stream will be put in the chat. So before I introduce our panel of speakers, I've been asked to provide a brief history of the Early Childhood Education Assembly. So the idea for this space for critically minded early childhood educators within NCTE began over 20 years ago. Increasingly noticeable was the disconnect, as Celia Ganeshi and Ann Haas Dyson later reflected on it, between the brilliant diversity of school children and the uniformity and regimentation of classroom practice in early childhood spaces. And moreover, as Dr. Soto-Manning pointed out, children of color, culturally and linguistically diverse children, immigrant children, and those from non-dominant backgrounds have been systematically excluded from what we come to know as early childhood education. And yet, at the same time, Jean Ann Clyde, an NCTE early literacy educator, noted that there was nothing about NCTE that really welcomed these early childhood teachers to have these necessary and important and critical conversations around what were perceived and what were grave issues in education. And so with these problems in mind, the nascent ideas for the ECEA began to form in 1997 with the establishment of the Early Childhood Issues Committee, which was originally chaired by Carrie Avery as a the work of early childhood educators within NCTE. And in 2004, the first day of early childhood was launched at NCTE's annual convention with the support of Jerry Harsty and Jean Ann Clyde. A few years after that, the initial formation of the ECEA was formed, and this was a formal space for early childhood educators within NCTE, prompted by a collective of early childhood teachers brought forth by Dr. Susie Long. At that time, Dr. Vivian Vasquez was elected as the first interim chair. And just about 2 years after that, in 2009, the official assembly was approved by NCTE. And the first 3 chairs were Vivian Vasquez, followed by Mariana Soto-Manning, followed by Dinah Volk. And we have the honor of listening to the 3 of them, as well as the 5th chair, Dr. Michelle Myers, talk to us today. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce this esteemed panel, but I also want to remind all of you that the introduction that will follow shortly will not do any of these scholars justice. My introduction will absolutely not capture the breadth and depth of all of their work. But for the sake of time, I'm keeping their bios brief. Just please know that their accomplishments in the field of early childhood education are vast and heavily influential on the work of many of us here today joining them. So Dr. Vivian Vasquez is a professor of education at American University. She has worked within the field of education for over 35 years, and her research interests are in critical literacy, early literacy, and information communication technology. Prior to working at AU, Vivian taught preschool and public school for 14 years. She has held appointed and elected positions in scholarly organizations, including NCTE. She has authored many publications and won many awards, including the 2019 NCTE Outstanding Educator in English Language Arts Award. Dr. Mariana Soto Manning is professor of early childhood education and teacher education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She is the director of the early childhood education and early childhood special education programs. She also holds academic appointments at the University of Iceland and King's College London. She has, from a critical perspective, Dr. Soto Manning's research examines inequities and injustices in early childhood teaching and teacher education, recentering methodologies and pedagogies on the lives, values, and experiences of intersectionality and experiences of intersectionality and minoritized people of color. She has also authored too many books and articles to name, and won many, many awards, including the 2011 AERA Division K Innovations in Research on Diversity in Teacher Education Award, and the 2017 AERA Teacher and Teacher Education Career Award. And her latest book is entitled In the Pursuit of Justice, and it includes Windows into Teaching in the Pursuit of Justice. Dr. Dinah Volk is Professor Emerita of Early Childhood Education at Cleveland State University. She has taught young children in the US and Chile and conducted research and published on the languages and literacies of bilingual children and their families, as well as culturally relevant pedagogies. She has authored and edited numerous journals and pieces, and journal articles and books and book chapters. And she also was the co-organizer and one of the first founding board members of the Professional Dyads and Culturally Relevant Teaching Project, which was actually here in this ECEA space. And certainly not least, we are going to be joined today by Dr. Michelle Myers, who is an associate professor at the University of South Carolina. Michelle has over 25 years of experience in education and has served in the capacity of early childhood teacher, curriculum coordinator, and principal. Currently, she teaches embedded literacy methods and reading assessment and culturally sustaining pedagogy courses for undergraduate and master's level pre-service teachers at the University of South Carolina. She has authored many articles as well and won many awards, including the Dr. Martin Luther King Award and the Black Faculty and Staff Association Community Advocacy Award by the University of South Carolina. So we are in good company. And with that brief introduction, I want to invite our first speaker, Dr. Vivian Vasquez, to begin.
Thank you so much, Erin. As I join you today, I want to acknowledge first off that the area from where I'm speaking is the traditional territory of Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people. And I acknowledge this legacy, find inspiration from this land, and acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism in our history as a nation and as a community, and always keep in mind the privileges we hold because of colonialism and strive not to perpetuate colonial futurity. The work of the ECEA and the work we will share today reflect the importance we place on framing the work that we do from a culturally responsive and culturally sustaining perspective that honors diverse children, in particular Indigenous, Black, Brown, Latinx, and minoritized children, creating a space for their diverse voices and identities to flourish. So thank you to all of you for being here with us this morning. All right, so people that I know who've seen my email inbox often comment, actually they laugh, at the number of messages that I have that I don't delete. If I were in the habit of deleting all my emails as I read them though, I wouldn't be able to read this message that I received from Susie Long in August 2007. So in Susie's email, she said, "We need a plan so that issues that impact teachers of very young children are more a part of the NCTE conference and the organization." So soon after that, we brought in Mariana into the conversation. And 3 months later, the NCTE conference in New York, we gathered together what Susie referred to as the Critical Friends of Early Childhood group, which included the people you see here today on the panel, as well as Gina and Clyde, Yvonne Suranyan, Malu Dantas, Anhas Tyson, Brian Edmiston, Celia Ganishi, Lori Katz, Heidi Mills, Tim O'Keefe, Katie Woodray, Debbie Wells-Rowe, and so many others. And you know, some of you are here with us today, Jesse Gander, Nancy Valdez. At that meeting in November, our focus was on teaching and learning across diverse ECE populations and to advance position statements going beyond usual NCTE position statements to include advocacy for culturally and linguistically diverse children, children of color, immigrant children, LGBTQX children, and all minoritized children who are systematically excluded from receiving a good education and who are not given opportunities to be who they are and to know who they are and why they matter in this world, as one step towards what Goldie Muhammad refers to as cultivating their genius. 16 months later, as noted by Aaron earlier, after a lot of proposal writing and filling out forms in March 2009, the NCTE Executive Committee accepted the ECEA as an assembly within NCTE. Now, this panel is about exploring the roles of early childhood educators in creating critically, culturally sustaining pedagogy. So why start with this history? And I think it goes without saying that teachers are teaching and students are learning during unprecedented times, that it behooves us all to take a step back and really think about why we do what we do, how we do what we do, and how we can do better to do, again, what Goldie Muhammad refers to as cultivating the genius in every young child, and doing so regardless of obstacles that may stand in our way, such as the pandemic that we're in and the racism issues exacerbated by the current political climate. One of the things I've learned from living through this pandemic is that we do need to do better. The ECEA and the folks involved with the organization provide for great company as we all try to do better. So please get involved and participate in ways that make sense for you. Today, I'm going to share two roles in particular that early childhood educators could take on to create critical, culturally sustaining pedagogies. The first is a role that early childhood educators can play outside of the classroom, which is really to support groups like this Early Childhood Education Assembly and our efforts to do this important critical work. When I think about creating critical, culturally sustaining pedagogies and what roles early childhood educators should play, I'm brought back to something that's been at the center of the work that I do, which is to build curriculum using the inquiry questions of children, their passions, their wonderings, their wanderings, and the topics that are important to them or that have importance in their lives. Because if you start there, you're starting from a place that lets them know that who they are and what they bring to the learning and teaching space matters. So this is the second specific role I want to briefly talk about. From a critical literacy perspective, this means how educators deploy pedagogical tools, attitudes, and philosophies should be contingent upon the students' everyday lived passions and problems, and of course, the ways in which teachers are able to navigate the big P, little p politics of the places and spaces in which their work unfolds. This seems particularly urgent at a time when facts are no longer considered relevant or important, when among so many other social issues, xenophobia and transphobic hate crimes are on the rise. Countries are closing their borders to thousands of desperate migrants. Children are being separated from their parents, and when global warming threatens the very survival of the planet. Critical literacy is a way of being and doing in the world, and is a space for creating critical, culturally sustaining pedagogies, could provide space to take on these sorts of issues, engaging learners in powerful and pleasurable ways toward creating spaces to achieve a better life for all. In spite of the fact, though, that critical literacy doesn't have a set definition or a normative history, there are still key tenets that do exist. However, these would likely take on different shape depending on one's orientation to critical literacy and one's social context. So let me just share some of these key tenets as they pertain to culturally sustaining pedagogies, and then I'll share a brief example. So critical literacy should be viewed as a lens, a frame or perspective for teaching throughout the day, across the curriculum, and perhaps beyond, rather than as a topic to be covered or a unit to be studied. Diverse students' cultural knowledge drawn from inside the classroom and the children's everyday worlds, homes, and communities, their funds of knowledge and multimodal and multilingual practices should be used to build curriculum across the content areas and across space and place. Inviting children to bring culturally meaningful artifacts to school enables meaningful discussions about an understanding of things that matter to different communities. Students learn best when what they are learning has importance in their lives. So using the topics, issues, and questions that they raise should be central to creating an inclusive, critical curriculum. And some of these things most of you have heard me talk about year after year. Texts are socially constructed from a particular perspective. They're never neutral. All texts are created from a particular perspective with the intention of conveying particular messages. So we therefore need to question with our students the perspectives on offer. The ways that we read text are never neutral. So each time we read, write, or create, we draw from our past experiences and understanding about how the world works. So we therefore should also analyze our own readings of text and unpack the positions from which we engage in the work that we do. From a critical literacy perspective, the world is seen as a socially constructed text that can be read, deconstructed, revised, rewritten, or reconstructed to shift or reframe the messages that are conveyed. Critical literacy involves making sense of the socio-political systems through which we live our lives and questioning these systems. So this means critical literacy work needs to focus on social issues, including inequities of race, class, gender, disability, and the ways in which we use language and other semiotic resources to shape our understanding of these issues. Critical literacy practices can be transformative as a result, and text design and production, which are essential to critical literacy work, can provide opportunities for transformation. So let me just quickly share with you an example from Brian Wood's kindergarten classroom in Ontario, Canada. And I see we have some people from Canada in the audience. This example took place midway through a school year where Brian had been framing his teaching from a critical literacy perspective. So his 4- and 5-year-old students had become really good at critically engaging with texts. This is about 5-year-old Cushy and her reading of a toy store flyer. Brian had read the flyers with the children and then asked the same kinds of questions that he had asked after reading picture books, for example. First, they read with the text by focusing on common interpretations and dominant understanding or widely accepted perspectives. So to do this, Brian asked the children questions like, why do you think the author is trying to, what do you think the author is trying to do or tell us? They then read against the text by focusing on alternate perspectives that challenge dominant understandings or viewpoints. And to do that, they responded to questions like, are the toys in the flyer ones that you would like? How are they the same or different from what you would like? And how do the toys that you see help you to think about what you can and can't do or who you can and can't be? So following this, Brian then had the children create their own version of the flyer. And using artist Jasper John's strategy, which is take an object, do something to it, and then do something else to it. The objects taken were magazines and discarded books through which 5-year-old Cushy searched for images or things that she felt she wanted to see in a toy flyer. To do something, Cushy cut out various images of things she felt should go into a flyer and glued them down onto a sheet of paper representing her flyer. To do something else to it, Brian had Cushy read with and against her own flyer. And doing so led Cushy to recognize that she couldn't see herself in the dolls in the original flyer. So she decided to add dolls with whom she could identify in her flyer. Brian also had the children find words and phrases to add to their redesigned flyer to make a statement about the way the catalog should be. In Cushy's redesigned flyer, it really represented her problematizing the lack of East Indian dolls in the catalog with which she could identify. Her flyer disrupts this gap. In Cushy's flyer, she deliberately included 4 images of East Indian dolls wearing more or less traditional outfits, along with words such as Supergirl and every home should have a range of diverse dolls and so forth. So, I just wanted to share that quick example because I think critical work such as this, and in this case done with, 3 to 5-year-old children, really provided multiple opportunities for the children Brian was working with to read with and against text, served as an opportunity for lingering with text through sustained engagement and conversation, which they were all very passionate about, created a space for Cushy and her classmates to identify, name, take up their issues, and afforded really a different discourse around toys and other things to surface that was more culturally relevant and sustaining, and that opened up space for Cushy and her classmates to make visible their home values and things of importance in their lives. Thank you.
Hi, friends. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday morning. I feel privileged to be in such good company. And I too join my good friend Vivian Vasquez, acknowledging that I am on Lenape land and acknowledging really the terrible legacy of colonialism that lives today. As I prepare to share my thoughts with you today, I could not help but think of the presidential election. What we have seen and are seeing is the reinscription of white supremacy, of anti-Black racism, visible in voter suppression, the denial of civil rights, of social political participation. It is because of this denial of rights that I decided to revise the question which guides this panel and instead ask, how might we move toward justice? I hope this presentation will help you think about our work ahead as it pertains to justice, to human rights, and to the necessary transformation to honor the humanity, the full humanity of Black, Indigenous, and children of color. I turn the word now to the wisest spirits I know, those who can guide us toward a future that does not yet exist, a more just future, young children.
Did you know that every person in the world has human rights?
Even children have rights. Human rights are the things that every person should have or be able to do to live a good life
with respect and security.
Every person in the whole world has these rights.
Did you know that every person...
Unless, this is true, unless, of course, you are in the US, the only country which has not to date ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is a legally binding international agreement setting out the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of every child, regardless of their race, religion, ability, ethnicity, immigration status. Yet, the US has communicated to the United States Human Rights Committee when the committee found that the US was coming up short in many areas, including child torture, gun violence, and carceral structures. Move along, there's nothing to see here. Well, I want to show you 3 pictures that illustrate how children's human rights are being violated right now, today, in the United States. The atrocities at the southern border, children in cages, trauma inflicted, child separation, racism, and xenophobia all rolled into one. These are devastating realities that stand against the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 1 defines the child as everyone under 18. Article 2 states all children have these rights, no matter who they are, where they live, what their parents do, what language they speak, whether they're rich or poor. No child should be treated unfairly on any basis. Article 10 reads, if you live in a different country than your parents do, you have the right to be together in the same place. Article 18, you have the right to be raised by your parents. Article 22, as we move on, Article 22, and I'm going to go back because this is important. You have the right to special protection and help if you're a refugee, as well as all the rights of the convention. The second picture that I show is Flint, predominantly Black children and families being poisoned, devastating consequences, a crime against humanity. If the US were a signatory, the UN would likely be intervening, not only in the national, but in the international atrocities that are being committed. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child states in Article 19, you have the right to be protected from any hurt and mistreated in your body, from being hurt and mistreated in body or mind. Article 24, you have the right to the best health care possible, safe water to drink. Article 27, you have the right to food, clothing, a safe place to live, and have your basic needs met. The third picture I show you is the picture of gun violence. Article 6 states you have the right to be alive. It is within this reality, punctuated by the violation of human rights of children, especially Black, Indigenous, and children of color's human rights, that I see our responsibility as early childhood teachers to suspend damage and harm, abuse and violence that are enacted in and through schooling, and to engage in the pursuit of justice by design. To do so, I engage with Maisha Wynn's transformative justice framework. While I'm not able to fully discuss this framework here today, I want to offer examples of how each of these matter in the construction of our current reality, a reality whereby the dehumanization of Black, Indigenous, and children of color are being normalized or the state, nation state, is doing nothing to stop it. I start with History Matters. As we look at Samuel Morton, it is important to note that racism was scientifically established. Samuel Morton studied cranial capacity by measuring size as intelligence. Although deeply flawed and now known to have been a fabricated study, this study still informs notions of Black children being less capable than white children, despite overwhelming research to the contrary. The second is Race Matters. In 1947, Clark and Clark showed via the white doll, black doll experiment that Black preschool children already saw themselves as lesser than white children. They saw whiteness as a desirable feature, as being supreme. This has shown to cause harm, inflicting psychological scars. And before we dismiss this as, okay, but this was in 1947, this is not a long ago study, but it has been redone within the past decade and has been documented. This phenomenon still persists not only within the context of the US, but also in the context of countries such as Mexico and Colombia. Now I turn to Justice Matters. But what is justice? And I ask because I think that a lot of times when we talk about justice, we're not talking about justice, we're talking about lawfulness. And the law has been used to disempower and dehumanize Black, Indigenous children of color, their families, their communities in many ways. So it's important to understand that sometimes we enact harm in the pursuit of justice. This notion of justice is aligned with English common law, which is predicated on the protection of property and privileges. Okay, by now you may be asking, what do you mean? As the National Museum of African American History and Culture illustrated, the notion of justice is based on English common law, protect property and entitlements, and prioritizes intent rather than impact. So macroaggressions are not protected. These are aspects of assumptions of whiteness and white culture within the context of the United States. Finally, language matters. Anti-Black linguistic racism, as described by April Baker Bell in her book, Linguistic Justice, is pervasive in everyday practices and early childhood education. Examples of racist, dehumanizing, and violent practices in early education, which enact harm onto Black, Indigenous, and children of color, are phonics. When we enact the instead of the sound. These position children who are not white as being broken. Standards for early learning, which include academic language as a measure of learning. Those position Black, Indigenous children of color as being incapable. Subject-verb agreements being aligned with white discourses, which position, again, those who are not white as or who do not align with whiteness and the communicative rules of whiteness as not knowing. Interactional norms that align to whiteness and therefore construct children who are not white as being rude. Conventions of politeness aligning with whiteness, which means that children who are Black, Indigenous, and of color are constructed way too often as behavior problems. We see that, for example, in the disproportionate suspension rate of Black preschoolers and in the carcerality of educational settings, or should I say miseducated settings. And we also see that in the devaluing of orality, the overprivileging of written text, which not only deem our children as illiterate, as having no language, no literacy, as having word gaps, but diminishes the power, the possibility of the legacy history, practices, and everydaynesses of their families, of their communities, of those they love and those who genuinely love them. So we must ask ourselves, how can early childhood educators build a future where abolitionism, liberation, and freedom are human rights of every children? And this is related to culturally relevant and sustaining teaching, because this question is predicated on the combination of high expectations with high levels of support. I think that part of the rhetoric that has been so problematic is the fact that people are all okay saying, well, we have high expectations. But then we reify cycles of oppression when there aren't high levels of support. So we set kids who don't have privileges and intergenerational wealth up for failure, whereas other kids who are typically white middle upper class, white English speaking kids as being more intelligent and more capable because their parents have profited, or their families intergenerationally have profited from indigenous, from Black, from Latinx labor, and therefore are able to afford extra support. So if we are going to move toward a revolution, we need to recognize that love is an inherent part of it. I want to share with you the understanding put forth by bell hooks that without justice, there can be no love. So you can't love kids, or you can't say that you love them if you're not going to uphold justice. But understand that love is an action. It's never simply a feeling. So you have to invest time. You have to work toward loving and investing in every single child you teach. And knowing that, some of the children have been intergenerationally overinvested, who do we focus our gaze and our efforts and center in our classrooms? So bell hooks wrote, the moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. Action saturated in what my partner in crime, Jessica Martel, calls the for real kind of love, with the potential to build a future where abolitionism, liberation, and freedom are human rights, include naming injustices and righting wrongs from a restorative justice perspective. Understanding how and that history matters, language matters, race matters, and upending anti-Black linguistic racism in our everyday practices. Now, questions with the potential to move us toward a future where abolitionism, liberation, and freedom are human rights include how is, and fill in the blank with the practice, policy, convention, approach, advancing justice or upholding injustices. There is no neutral path. If upholding injustices, what's the root of the issue? How can we understand it historically? Whose voices are being heard in silence, centered or ignored, and why? How can we interrupt it based on social movements, learning from social movements across time and space, such as civil rights, Black Lives Matter, the APL? How are race and racism entangled with this issue that is upholding injustice? How am I complicit? How am I protecting and reenacting this injustice in my classroom and my approaches? How is my language working for or against the sustenance of this issue? And how can I would invite you to ask, what can we do to move toward deconstructing injustice and constructing more just futures? So I want to really remind us that our responsibility as early childhood education teachers is not to remain in the sidelines. It is to actively work toward the kind of justice that leads us to suspend damage and harm, abuse and violence enacted in and through schooling, and engage in the pursuit of justice by design. Always remember, we're stronger together as a community. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's exciting and challenging to follow these two amazing presentations. This session feels a bit like a reunion, but it also feels very much like a chance for all of us to grow and to think together. As Mariana just said, together we are much more powerful and we have much more potential to make change. So I think this is one of the things that this session is all about. My session is entitled Play-Based Early Childhood Programs, Interrogating Our Perspectives and Practices. And I want to start by reading to you about a Star Wars episode from a play-based early childhood program. We'll be the good guys. 6-year-old James points to himself and 2 other boys, Martin and Thomas. They are all white. James points to Alex and says, and he's the bad guy. Alex is black. The 3 white boys run off shouting, "Get away from him. He's bad. Blasters out." Alex runs after them. The boys wield their laser blasters and lightsabers made of toilet paper rolls, cardboard, and bottle caps. As they sprint from space to space in the large yard, they periodically pause to duel or square off, making pew, pew, pew sounds as they shoot out with the blasters. So this episode and the body of this presentation that I'm making come from an article entitled Interrogating the Gold Standard, Play-Based Early Childhood Education and Perpetuating White Supremacy. It's an article that's going to be appearing in a special issue of Theory and Practice. And I was a co-author along with Tim Kennard, Jesse Gaynor, Nancy Valdez Gaynor, and Susie Long. The episode itself was part of a summer program for at-risk preschoolers and kindergartners. And so it's important to indicate that that at-risk label was the one that the state used to identify the children in the program as deficient from the get-go. It was organized by Tim and Nancy and Jesse as a play and inquiry workshop. And by that, they understood it as a place for children to play with each other, to play with materials in the pursuit of making their own meaning in their imaginative worlds. About 2/3 of the children in the program were Latinx, and of the children in the program, about half the families spoke Spanish. So Nancy and Tim and Jesse made very effective work about valuing Spanish as a part of the official curriculum in order to counteract the hegemony, the dominance of English, which ordinarily occurs without those specific efforts. So if we go back and think about that Star Wars episode, and if we look at it with an anti-racist, a pro-Black lens, we see, one, the white children felt entitled to lead and to label others, that Alex was positioned as the bad guy and he was shot, that Blackness was a symbol of badness, that Martin and Thomas, the ones who didn't do the labeling at first, however, enabled the play, they did not interrupt it. And as the teachers learned later, Alex had acquiesced unwillingly in the play, even though he was a great Star Wars fan. So in many early childhood programs, that episode might go unnoticed or it might go unproblematized. And teachers, if they noticed it, might struggle with how to respond in the moment. And I'm sure that those of you listening to this are probably thinking, oh, what would I have done if I had seen that on my playground? And what we argue in the article is that the real problem is that there was no foundational curriculum to foreground Alex's humanity as a Black child, to provide a basis for children and teachers to effectively respond, to provide opportunities for learning more just ways to interact and to play. And in the absence of that daily foundational curriculum, children incorporated into their play the racialized power structures and anti-Blackness from the broader society. Whether they wanted to or not, they certainly didn't. the children and their teachers were a part of perpetuating white supremacy. Some things to think about, some things to recognize. One is that anti-Black violence is inflicted on young children of color in school and out. And play and choice, those wonderful aspects of early childhood programs, which we talk about often as central and value-free and universal, are really concepts that can be Eurocentric and highly problematic at times. That anti-Black violence can be embedded in play-centered early childhood classrooms, even when teachers consider themselves to be anti-racist. So here, one of our jobs is thinking about what are our roles as early childhood educators and activists. And I speak particularly to those of us who are white, and would argue that one of our roles is to interrogate that gold standard of play-based early childhood programs and to reimagine play. Some necessary background, some concepts. Dumas and Ross have written about what they call Black crit, and it argues that anti-Blackness is not just racism against Black people, but it refers to a broader antagonistic relationship between Blackness and the possibility of humanity. In that episode, in that Star Wars episode, Alex's humanity was denied. Nathaniel Bryan has written brilliantly about Black boys and their play and what he calls Black play crit. And his words certainly apply to other children of color, but his focus is on Black boys. And he writes that during enslavement and the afterlife, that is now, Black boys continue to be denied, excuse me, Black boys continue to be denied the ability to enjoy the privileges and pleasures of play similar to their white children counterparts. Their play is ignored, policed, surveilled, critiqued, and stolen. Thus, as Nelson has written, play can be considered white property if it is what white children do. Bryan goes on to write, Black boys who experience the psychological trauma of Black physical death and spirit murder understand that in the broader white-dominated society, their lives do not matter, even during play. And it's in his 2020 article that he writes about Tamir Rice, who here in Cleveland, a 12-year-old playing in a park, was murdered. So what's our role? Yolanda Seeley Ruiz would argue that we need to start with an archaeology of the self. That's a wonderful image. And that really requires a deep, critical, ongoing self-reflection about our beliefs and our biases and how the forces of the societies in which we live inform and impact on those beliefs and biases. It's critical reflection on our identities in order to work toward a pedagogy of critical love. What else can we do? We can decenter whiteness and center Blackness. We can ask ourselves some of these questions. How can I decenter whiteness and recognize the pervasive power of the white gaze? And that refers to the words of Toni Morrison, who talks about the fact that in US society in particular, that something is not of value unless it is seen and perceived and valued by white people. We can also ask ourselves, what is anti-Blackness? Why is it important to identify and counter it in my teaching? How can I center Blackness and the humanity of Black people? How can I create a pro-Black classroom? And Gloria Boutte has written about this with others, where teaching Blackness as strength and beauty is foundational, explicit, and daily, as is the development of teachers and children's critical consciousness. We can create a pro-Black curriculum, and Bryan talks about, that is Nathaniel Bryan talks about using a multiplicity of Black texts that highlight and celebrate the beauty and diversity and contributions of Black people. stories of the everyday lives of Black people and characters, counter narratives to white dominant ones. And it's also about helping children recognize anti-Black injustices and strategies for countering them, talking about pro-Black activists in the real world, talking about children's activism and what that means and what they can do within the classroom and without. And also what we can do is to think about responding in the moment with justice in mind. And again, I want to reiterate that that needs to happen within the context of that pro-Black curriculum. So that teachers can respond by respecting children as thinkers and change agents. Certainly, hopefully that's what we're always doing as early childhood educators, but also by creating spaces for talk in interactions of safety and love to identify children's reinscription of racial violence. We can do that by centering the voices and experiences of children of color. We can do that by discussing strategies with all children that reflect justice, whether it's in the moment or for later analysis. Jesse and Tim in their work have talked about engaging in play work, which may be one way forward and one way to reimagine play. They write that play work requires us to think of play in all its complexities, fun, but painful, hard, tense, dissonant, touching, and alarming. It's what children do when they narrate their imagined lives, incorporating old and new experiences, learning to act and react in a racialized world. And we can't forget that part of it. They are doing this imaginative play in our racialized world in which we all live. Some other questions to consider. Is pro-Black curriculum foundational and daily in my classroom? Do I intentionally help children recognize anti-Black injustice and learn strategies for acting against it? Do I enter children's in the moment interactions with an eye for racial justice, knowing how to respond in ways that do not send unjust behaviors underground? Because I'm sure those of us who have children, who live with children, who spend time with children know that if they sense our disapproval, they often will continue those behaviors, what will do them in ways that we can't see them. And that's not what we want. We want to be able to help children analyze those injustices in productive ways. And we need to consider whether children can use play to engage in the hard work of trying out justice-based actions. I want to end with a quote. This is from some writing by Cynthia Saavedra, and I'm going to just tweak it a little bit near the end. Often people think of early childhood as busy playgrounds, Play-Doh, and happy children. Though that image soothes us, we must realize that children are with us in this world, a world full of complexity, nuance, tragedy, and wrapped in a Euro-American and colonialist understanding of the world, while adhering to a neoliberal ordering of this world. Early childhood education then is, and I would change it to say early childhood education then can be another important component of social justice. It's up to us. Thank you.
So thank you all, panelists. It's certainly my privilege to serve as a respondent to what you've just shared. And I was copiously taking notes of a lot of things that you shared that have been questions or thoughts that have been on my mind. Vivian, you talked about critical race and critical literacy, that it's so necessary because it ensures the students that we teach, the children that we teach, a place to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. You talked about, you know, whose perceptions are being honored and whose are being denied. And then you also talked about places of transformation. And Mariano, you went on to explain that we have to think about justice in a way that entails love. And one of the things that I am always troubled by is that my definition of love may be completely different from how someone else perceives that. And then, Dinah, you went ahead and you spoke specifically about how play is not just, an enactment of fun all the time. It can be spaces where episodes of power and racial structures and oppression can be internalized because of how students have been socialized into those areas. And then you helped us to think about, like, this work starts with us drawing on Yolanda Celia Ruiz's model about archaeology of self. And so as I bring us to a close, I want to say that I'm coming to you from the area of Utahville, South Carolina. And it was the home of the Santee tribe. The mighty Cherokee named the area in which I live Utah for the tall pines and the trees and the mounds at the great Santee River. I love this space because it offers me opportunities to commune with the elements, and water being one of my elements. And one of the things that you all asked, each one of you in your presentation, was, where does this work start and how do we begin? And here's something that I want to talk back to that. I want to talk back to the radical shifts that we have to make. And in doing so, I want to start with a quote from Bettina Love, who says, "The barriers of racism, discrimination, and concentrated poverty and access to college, persistent structural barriers cannot be eradicated by tweaking the system or making adjustments. We must struggle together." And that was one of the things that I heard across all three of you. We must struggle together, not only to reimagine schools, but to build new schools that are taught to believe that are impossible, schools based on the intersections of justice, anti-racism, love, healing, and joy. And that is what I heard across all of your responses. And so in thinking about, like, how do we do this work and why is this work necessary? I have come to the thought that we have to make radical shifts because it matters. And we have to teach for equity and justice. And so the radicals shift. So what I think that we have to do in doing this work, we have to be radical enough to know that we cannot stand by and watch time after time children being oppressed, caged, dishonored, dehumanized, because that's our legacy that we have been given, but that's not the legacy that we have to stand by. And so when I think about who are the people that will do the work, who are the radicals, I advocate thoroughly for these kinds of people, people who are not scared because of social and political reforms. These are people who understand that the shift is necessary because it is foundational to everything that we believe. And all of you here have espoused that you're radical enough to make shifts. And when I think about the shifts, it's not just the little tweaks that Bettina Love has reminded us of. It is dismantling those systems of oppression that we are a part of. And it's not being afraid to do so, even if you're the only one doing the work. And when I think about equity, I think about it's giving every student exactly what that student needs to make things fair and just. And then when I think about justice, I think about it being exactly what you responded, Mariana, where you says it's situated in love, the kind of love that says, I see you, I know you, and I have the work within me and the strength within me, the power within me, the autonomy within me to make sure that the love that I feel is not just an emotion, but it's an action, and it's going to be evident in everything that I do. And so when I look at this, what are those radical shifts that we need to make? I think that there are 6 things that we need to do. And I don't have time in my 15 minutes to share with you in detail all of them, but I'm going to name them and give you a little bit of what I think these shifts look like. So first shift that I think, we have to create schools that are foundational. At the foundation is equity and justice. And so that means we have to dismantle systems that privilege those and oppress or marginalize others. What does that look like? That look like interrogating what is the curriculum, who is being seen in the curriculum, who is not seen in the curriculum, whose voice is privileged in the curriculum, whose are not. We have to dismantle those. We have to look at what we're teaching. We have to do the work of introspection of self, to think about what are those beliefs that we have that are grounded in whiteness, and what are those beliefs that we have that are grounded in injustice, and interrogate how did we learn that, and dismantle those. That work starts with us being truthful and honest with ourselves. So first, we have to create schools that are built on the foundations of equity and justice. The second shift that I think we need is we need to realize that we see color, and we need to see color. We need to admit that. The colorblind ideology does not work. Many white people subscribe to the colorblind ideology, and they say or feel that Black, indigenous people of color are not given the same rights because they say, I don't see color. Yes, you do. You really do. And it's a stance of being colorblind that denies people of color their rights within any system. Admit that you see color. It's okay. I could go further with that. The third shift is one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about. Become an anti-racist. I have lots of time heard folks say, well, I'm not racist. There's not a binary of racist, anti-racist. That is the binary. The non-racist stance is not one that is going to benefit us in any way. So racism has been institutionalized in every system that we are a part of. And it is difficult sometimes for folks to admit this. However, to begin the work of introspection of self, as well as doing the work of being pro-Black or working so that you can dismantle the anti-racist practices, you have to become an anti-racist in order to do this work. So what does this mean? This means what Ibram Kendi says. He reminds us that it's not enough to be non-racist. One has to take the stance of seeing race and working against policies that oppressed others. Being non-racist is not enough. We have to be anti-racist. Shift number 4. One of the things that I see that happens in many schools, and it troubles me, is that we have a discipline system that only targets those who do not subscribe to whiteness as politeness, is what you spoke about earlier, Mariana. And here's what I think that we need to shift to do. We need to think about instituting restorative discipline practices that are based on the humanizing concept of seeing people for who they are and bringing them back into the group. One of the things that has been written is the cradle to prison pipeline. And we have these zero tolerance policies in schools that often police Black and brown bodies in ways that do not police other bodies. However, if we think about ways to help students be affirmed and centered in curriculum, be acknowledged as brilliant and bright, we need to make sure that our ways of dealing with management is in a position of restoring them to the fold, as opposed to excommunicating them. If we continue to use discipline practices that only have zero tolerance policies, we are certainly sending our Black and brown students to prison quicker than enough. I have seen time and again on social media students who are in ECE being handcuffed as a lesson for how to behave in school. That is problematic to me. What message does that send to a 6-year-old? That's seriously an injustice in my mind. So when we're instituting restorative justice practices, we have to think about, like, how do we bring students back into the circle of self, or draw on the African concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are. Anytime that you're a part of something, we are a part of something, okay? Shift number 5. And this is something that is so timely given the current crises that we all find ourselves in. Institute trauma-informed teaching. A lot of times children are sitting in our classrooms and they are experiencing internalized trauma because of all of the messages that they've received, or they're experiencing internalized trauma because of things that have happened. And what we have to do is we have to know that students need us to not only care about their cognitive and intellectual stance, we need to care about their full humanity. That means seeing them as a person, seeing that their well-being is taken care of. So we have this to make this shift. And I'm going to share a story with you early in my teaching career. It happened in my 2nd year of teaching. I had a student who came into my classroom and she was displaying a different behavior from what I had noticed before. And all I was concerned about, young and novice, all I was concerned about was her reading in her small group. But because I was so in tune with her, I said to her, I'm going to come to your house later on this afternoon because I need to talk with your mom in regards to what's going on. And when I got to the house, lo and behold, I come to find out that this child's mom had been shot, and shot by someone who the child cared about. And so the part of me that realized, okay, me as a teacher, I was only focused on your cognitive well-being, whereas I should have been focused on you, the whole child, the whole child. So I learned early in my career that it's not enough just to be a teacher of them intellectually. I have to be a teacher of their full humanity. And now that we are in this crisis, we have students who are experiencing all kinds of trauma. They're being assaulted by so many facets. The media is one avenue that they're being assaulted by. How do we as teachers who truly care and love the children in the way that matters help them? We have to make that shift. And then the last thing, and this is drawing on the work that I've done and work that I continue to do. The shift number 6 is we have to treat families with dignity and respect, and we have to learn from and with them. And in doing this work, that means getting to know families beyond just what they show up in school as, beyond the stereotypes that we have situated or thought about in regards to them. We have to get to know them on a level that matters. We have to become a part of that network of support that draws on all of the resources that we have available to us in order that we do this work and do this work effectively. So the question that I now have for us to consider is, if we understand our positions as radicals who need to make shifts, when do the shifting start? And my answer to you is simple. That shifting has to start now. We have to transform schools so that it becomes spaces where all students, Black and Brown students in particular, because they don't find spaces in schools that affirm them, where they can feel a part of the system, but not only feel a part of the system, where they can be a part of the system, and we honor them fully as well as their humanity. And so as we think about these, I want us to consider that this shift starts now. I was trying to monitor the chat for you all as panelists for us to think about, like, what are the questions? And I have a question that was just posed to me on yesterday. And it was one that I went to bed thinking about. And one that I responded, but I would love to hear your response to this. I was asked by one of my colleagues, do you think that the work that you do with critical social justice, with anti-racist pedagogy, that that's appropriate for students who are in ECE? And I know what I said, but I would love to know, like, how would you respond to someone who asks that question?
Do you want us to speak up?
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that part of one of the things that I do with my own students is thinking about, from the time that we are setting baby rooms in pastel colors, playing European lullabies, that's already pulling them into white supremacy. So part of it is we can't afford not to. And there are plenty of studies that children have already developed affective associations with race and color by 6 months of age. So we can't afford not to, because we're not teaching in a vacuum. I think that going back to Geneva Gay's framework in terms of thinking about the societal curriculum is anti-Black, it's racist. It's really thinking about how is it that that's a reification of a history of white supremacy. Then we have the symbolic curriculum, which is our kids and their voices, their images, their values being seen in the curriculum in schooling and interactions and valued. And then we have the formal curriculum, which is really thinking about what we plan within the context of the classroom. So that can't be regarded as being in a vacuum. That's all part of the societal curriculum. So if we do not work against the societal curriculum, then we're working with it because we're part of that machinery. So we have to work against the current, even if we are going to stay in the same place. It's like the current of white supremacy is always coming through the societal curriculum and enacted in the symbolic one.
Thank you, Mariana.
Michelle,
Yes,
could I? Yeah, hi, everybody. So good to see everyone. Yes, I mean, and then continuing from what Mariana was saying, you know, there's so much research that says what children learn from a young age. And there are a couple things I think would be important to point out to people. I found that Erin Miller's research with her own children has been some of the most powerful that I have shared with pre-service teachers. And I remember, Erin, when you were going into it thinking, well, I don't think that we really talk about race that much, so I might not have anything. And she ended up with so much about the messages her white children were receiving day in and day out about the supremacy of whiteness. And Erin can share a little bit more about that. The other thing is, we've got example after example, but the very example that Dinah read of the 5- and 6-year-old boys playing Star Wars, show that to somebody and say, young kids don't know about race? Just look at what they have already internalized. And it's not just the white boys in that episode that had internalized their supremacy. The Black child also had internalized, well, I guess I have to just take this on, or I won't be able to be a part of the play, had internalized that already. So I would definitely draw on the research and those kinds of examples that make it so real.
Thank you both. Yes. And I agree with you. That's exactly what I said. I said, do you not think that children get messages all of the time through the ways that they've been socialized? And where do those messages come from? Those messages come from little things like buying a little girl a pink shirt, or saying to a little boy, you know, you can't have this gun because later on someone is going to think that, you know, you're dangerous. One of the things one of my colleagues posted just a few weeks ago was a picture of her son, and how everyone on social media had commented that he was such a cute little boy, such a cute little boy. And then her question became like, when does it change from him becoming a cute little Black boy to now someone who is a threat? And so when do we get those messages, and how do we get those messages, and how do we stop those messages? That's another question. How do we stop those messages, or how do we talk back to them?
Michelle,
I was just gonna add one more quick thing to follow up. Sorry, Dinah. But, another thing that many, many people post and talk about is that, if we're saying white kids can't handle this, all we're doing is just coddling them in to continue to, not see what's happening. Because Black kids have to figure out how to build the fortitude to handle this. And then if we say when people become white adults and they don't have, like Robin DiAngelo says, as white people, we don't have the stamina to be able to address these issues or even understand them. That's where you start building that stamina when kids are very young.
Yes. Dinah, you were going to say something.
I was just going to speak a little bit also to the myth that young children are innocent and incapable of taking on these issues. At the beginning of in her introduction, Erin mentioned the Professional Dyads and Culturally Relevant Teaching Project, and I think, which was started in order to look at the practicalities and the possibilities for young children of doing this kind of work. And it has generated lots of webinars and writing that talk about all the multiple ways that young children can actually think critically. I think also of Vivian's work that has made those possibilities quite clear. I'm thinking too, one of the teachers in the project, probably in the first cohort, was talking about what was happening in 2016 when the election was going on. And the principal was saying, don't talk to the children about those issues. They can't deal with it. And for the teachers, it was the children's questions. The children were coming in with questions about the election, about Trump, about immigration. So yes, young children are aware of those issues. They are embedded in this culture, in this society with us, and they have the critical capacities to address them. Absolutely.
I agree. And I think one of the comments that I see in the chat that Mariana has written is that we're socializing them into race evasiveness. And as when we say we don't see color, like we're socializing them into race evasiveness. They're not colorblind. Mariana, will you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what does that entail?
Yes, and I'm happy to. And I want to start by honoring the work of Subini Anama, who is a disability studies scholar from an intersectional perspective. And she talks about this term of evasiveness because we should not be ableist. We can see color. When you look at this background here, you can see that this is pink, and you can see that this is yellow. You can see that my shirt is black. So we can all see color. What we are doing is we're evading breathing into the hierarchy of how race is determining inclusion and exclusion within society. So the evasiveness is the invisible bordering of who belongs and who doesn't, as capable, as beautiful, as, so really thinking about how the politics of belonging is deeply racialized and how we are evading, we're saying, well, there isn't an issue because it doesn't affect me, which is the very definition of white privilege. So it's really thinking about how it's not color, it's race. And it's race as white property, it's race as a system of exclusion. It's not race as a biological marker, but as a property that, according to what Cheryl Harris has written about. And when we think about racial literacy and the durable grammar of racism within our classrooms, it is easy to evade those structures because we just see them as they just are. So we need to invade instead of evade. When we evade, we're complicit. One of my master's degree students, Sofia Trujillo, talks about this concept of bystander versus abstander, which I think it's really, I just learned from her this semester. And she talks about how you can be a bystander or you can be an abstander, but to be an abstander, you are interrupting these structures.
Absolutely. That's some work that I definitely will read, because race is is a construct of white property. It's not just color. I see that my internet is unstable. We have time for questions from our audience to the panelists. So if you want me to ask it, post it in the chat. But otherwise, if you unmute yourself, we'll acknowledge you in that regard.
Hello, this is Shashray. I do want to ask a question about, as we're talking about race. I'm trying to tweet us out and do everything at the same time. I'm on like another meeting too, sorry. But I really want to address, as we think about when we're talking about color, of course we see the color on the map that's happening with voting right now. And we're also thinking about how over 80% of our teachers are white females. We're also thinking about how more white women voted for Trump this time around. We're also thinking about how majority of our 80% of our teachers are white, but they're females as well. So how do we be these upstandards? And what Mariana was speaking to about evasiveness, how do we hold these teachers accountable? Where is the accountability? Because we can have all of these resources, we can talk all of this information, which has been amazing, but what do we do to hold these teachers accountable for the racist acts, the anti-Blackness acts that they have toward our students?
I know other people will have more relevant things to say about whiteness precisely. I do want to mention a couple of things. One of them is, it's not just on white teachers, it's on teacher education as a structure of white supremacy, and it is about the whiteness of teacher educators as well. So there is that. The other thing is, we behave as if teacher education was always white, which is not the case at all. After Brown, so many of the Black teacher education programs were disintegrated into white ones. So what can we learn from these legacies? I mean, my work is mostly with teachers of color, with Black teachers, with Latinx, Asian American teachers, a couple of indigenous, but really thinking about also the other structures. It's not just on teachers. I don't want to excuse them, but I do think that sometimes we need to back up and think about our complicity.
One of the things that Shashari, that I do in my class, because I teach in a master's program, and the majority of the teachers that I work with, pre-service teachers that I work with, are white. And the beginning this work, I follow exactly what Yolanda Seeley Ruiz has talked about with archaeology of self. Like, I spend the majority of my course doing work with having those pre-service teachers do introspections, like how have their lived identities influenced or provided them access and privileges that are often denied to others. And then just to make them critically aware of this, because a lot of times what they espouse is that I often get this is, I didn't know that this was I didn't know this, I didn't know that, I didn't. And so what I share with them is that once you are aware, then now what are the actions that you take? So the way that class is structured, I do the first few weeks of introspection of self, where they're engaged or interrogating the ways that they've lived in this world. And then we do an interrogation of our teaching. Like, what are those teaching practices that often are built on concepts of whiteness, and how are their voices of students who you will actually teach missing from your curriculum? And then what do you need to do in regard to making sure that those voices are given just as much fair representation as any other voice? And then we look at introspection of society. Like, what does this mean in the work that we do in the world? Like, exactly what you're talking about, like with social issues, even with the election that is currently going on. Like, how do you interrogate structures in society that often privilege some while at the same time oppressing others? And so that becomes, like the foundation or the work, so that when they then become teachers, it is my hope that they will do this work and do the work well. But that doesn't stop there. Then it's my duty, as Mariana and everyone else on the panel have just said, is to think about, like, how do you interrogate those institutional practices, even when you're the only one doing that? How do you call attention to that? How do you dismantle policies? How do you help others who are in positions of power to realize that their lone perspective is not the only perspective that is of value? And so doing this work requires you to take on radical shifts so that we can dismantle all of these systems that have been in place and that many honor as the right thing.
I think too, if I could piggyback on that as well, Michelle and Shashay, good to see you and thank you for your question. I just want to follow up with a really quick big response and then a small response. The big response is really why we're all here, I think. Because if we don't start this work in early childhood spaces, then white children who grow up in race evasive places, and I don't just mean schools, and as you pointed out, this is happening in churches, this is happening in communities, this is happening in neighborhoods. If they grow up never being asked to directly confront racism, then they are going to become those teachers who are so, fragile or resistant, or, pick the word of the day, but are going to, resist taking up anti-racist stances. So fundamentally, I think the work starts where we are. But I would also say that, I've been very inspired to make some changes in my own department because of the work that's being done at the University of South Carolina in their early childhood department, where they have taken a very explicit stance against anti-Blackness and a very explicit statement saying that their work in the program is going to centralize issues of anti-racism. And their students have to sign that before they enter into the program. And so we are, because of that, have been inspired to adopt similar policies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And it's amazing some of the pushback we've gotten from faculty. That's for a whole nother conversation. But I will say, if our white pre-service teachers cannot talk about Black people, they should not be in teacher education programs, period. And we need to get them out before they come in, rather than dealing with the headache that they cause us when they're in and they cannot take up these issues critically. And maybe it's because that's how they've been socialized, but that they shouldn't be in the space which is fundamentally about justice, if they cannot have a conversation about race. So those are some things that I see that we can do this in big and small ways.
Thank you, Erin, because that's exactly it.
Michelle,
deal with the problem, report becomes the problem. Go ahead, Susie.
I mentioned the interrogations document that some of us have been working on that we're hoping to get, published somewhere, but Kamani Winter-Hoyt, Eliza Braden, Gloria Bucci, and Mayor Mueller and I have worked all summer on a document that provides questions for examination across higher education, but it could be adapted to organizations like NCTE. In fact, the Diversity Committee is going to be talking about this in our meeting coming up later this afternoon. But across higher education, teacher education programs and classrooms. And it's basically, it's called In Every corner examining to be able to identify anti-Blackness in our institutions, and then take action to dismantle, in Mariana's words, and counter it. So anyway, hopefully that will be available for use soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susie.
And I think that part of it is we need to also continue working for teacher work conditions. Like the reason why teaching is so white is that the salaries were gutted when they wanted to keep the teaching profession white. So how is it that we say, you know, the gutting of teacher salaries so that they could be the wives of, there was the assumption of men who made the salary, and that was more of a charity kind of thing, needs to be decimated. We need to also fight for people of color, of Black, Indigenous, teachers of color to be rightfully paid and not to be harmed within their programs. Because Erin, absolutely, Erin, I applaud you. And I think that part of it is it's inconvenient for us, but ultimately it's deeply harmful. It inflicts trauma onto our children when these teachers are spending so much time with our babies.
Ooh, there's a great question in here I just saw from, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Norhin, says, I have seen colored professors also pick on, okay, I can't see the rest of it because it cut off. Could somebody please address that question? I think it's a great question.
So it says, I've seen colored professors also pick on colored students. How would I address that without coming off as offensive?
Let's look at that term colored for a second as well, too, please.
Yeah, so I would say that first of all, the term is colored is a term that is not humanizing, although historically it has been employed. It is a person of color, and most, and now we're even moving beyond that in terms of thinking about identifying racially and ethnically. I think we see that a lot in terms of like how the media, in terms of votes, has been talking about Latinx communities. There are white Latinx, there are indigenous Latinx, there are Black Latinx, like Afro Latinx. So let's just really make sure that we talk about that. To the question, Norhan, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but oh no, please, it's okay. I think that part of it is when we know better, we do better. That's my belief always. So thank you for asking the question. I think that the other thing is not all skin folk are kinfolk. So let's be real here. And the other thing is many people of color had to approximate whiteness and pledge allegiance to the code of white supremacy in order to enter this field. Otherwise, you're chastised, you're excluded. So there is like academia is a white space. Education is a white space. It's much easier for you to develop. And W.B. Du Bois wrote about this in 1837. So it's still the case, but really thinking about how self-hate, as I showed in terms of an internalized racism, as I showed with the Clark and Clark study, starts from the time that young children are really, really young. So really thinking about like, it is a product of this system that cranks out white supremacy under the guise of Americanness.
I also think that what's true is that from the perspective of white people, teachers of color often appear to be picking on or being too harsh with children of color. And so I think we also need to interrogate that notion of picking on children. It may be, in fact, that they are using what is sometimes called a warm demanding style, which appears to be too harsh from the perspective of the white gaze. So the question is a complex one, and we need to understand and recognize it may be the white gaze there that is seeing the teacher picking on the children, when in fact what the teacher is doing is, in the name of love, demanding and providing support for high achievement.
Y'all, can we talk about sorry, the fact that we have the first Black Vice President in the history of the United States.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
You have the green and the pearl. This is
And she is a
fantastic.
star. Ski-wee.
Backing her up.
She is a star. So, yeah, backing her up. All right, thank you all. Are there any other questions? I know that we have the next session starts at 12. So are there any other questions that we would like to consider?
Michelle, I just saw very early on someone asked about the resources that were mentioned in all of our presentations. So I'm thinking that we may be able, after this day is over, be able to put together a list of those resources. We'll talk to Sandra about maybe posting it on the website or making it available in some way or another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Erin, I will turn it back over to you. But before I do, I would like to just say thank you all for coming. Your presence here shows the importance of this work for you. And just go ahead and do the work. Do the work. So Erin, back to you.
Thank you all so much. It was great to see you all. I'm just going to put some final slides up here to indicate some next steps. Please make sure that you share with friends and families and colleagues what you learned today. It was great to see everybody. And thank you to our amazing panelists today.